All right, let's get those thinking caps on because today we are diving deep into the world of H. Bradley,
Oh, H. Bradley.
a philosopher who, well, in his time he was a big deal,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't really hear his name much anymore. Kind of faded from view.
Yeah.
So we're going to use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Oh, excellent resource.
It really is. It's a great starting point to
Yeah.
understand. It's about any philosophical topic.
Yeah.
So consider this deep dives, like a cheat sheet or a shortcut to, like, well, who was Bradley? What was he all about? Why was he so influential?
Right.
And do his ideas, still have any weight in the 21st century? I mean,
Well, that's the question, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
what's so interesting about Bradley is that he was the British philosopher, of his time,
Mhm.
but his reputation really took a nosedive after he died,
Really?
And it makes you wonder, what happened, what changed in philosophy that kind of led to this
Yeah, that's a big shift.
really dramatic shift in his in how people saw him.
Yeah. So before we get into the, really complex stuff,
Yeah.
can we just get a picture of who Bradley was as a person?
Oh, sure.
Like paint a picture for us.
Yeah, so picture Oxford in the late 1800s, and you've got this brilliant but very reclusive scholar who, well, he kind of shuns the limelight, much prefers the company of his ideas.
Hmm.
This was Bradley. He was born in 1846, spent most of his life at Oxford, and died there in 1924.
Okay.
Came from a family of high achievers, but he was known for being a bit of an eccentric. Avoided public appearances, and get this,
What?
he actually took aim at the college cats with his shotgun.
He shot at cats.
He did. He shot at cats.
Oh, my gosh. Okay, well, we have to go back to that.
Yeah,
We have to know
yeah.
more about that. But first, you said he was super influential in his time.
Oh, yeah.
Like he was a rock star of philosophy.
He was. I mean, in Britain at that time, idealism was a major force, and Bradley was like the leading figure of
Okay.
this movement.
All right, so what was it about his ideas? What was so captivating about his views?
Well, for one thing, he introduced new ideas, like from continental philosophers, people like Kant and Hegel. Those
Oh,
were
okay.
pretty radical ideas at the time in British philosophy.
Yeah.
So it was really a breath of fresh air.
So he kind of shook things up a little bit?
He did. He really revitalized the philosophical scene. And he was offering these new ways of thinking
Okay.
about some really fundamental issues.
Okay, so like a philosophical trendsetter in a way, bringing those European influences in. But then you said his star faded. Like, what happened?
Yeah.
What led to that?
Well, it's kind of a complex story. There are a lot of factors, that contributed to it.
Like what?
So you had the decline of British imperialism, which, well, some idealists like Bradley had actually supported.
Okay.
So there was a bit of, backlash against those ideas.
Right.
And then you have the rise of analytic philosophy with figures like Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore,
Yeah.
who, well, they directly challenged a lot of Bradley's core ideas.
Okay.
And then on top of that, you have logical positivism coming along. And, well, they basically dismissed metaphysics. That's a key area of Bradley's work as completely meaningless.
Wow, so kind of a rough time to be
Oh, yeah.
a metaphysician. It
Yeah.
sounded like a perfect storm brewing against Bradley's ideas.
Right, right.
But, okay, so you mentioned that there's been a bit of a resurgence, a renewed interest in his work.
Yeah.
Like, why is that? Why are modern philosophers going back and looking at this guy whose ideas, were supposedly so outdated?
I think one reason is, well, as philosophers go deeper into the history of their discipline, they realize that figures like Bradley, even if they, ultimately disagree with them,
Right.
they were still grappling with important questions,
Yeah.
that still resonate today. And, understanding the trajectory of philosophical thought
Right.
helps us understand where we are now
Right.
and maybe where we're going.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's dive into the heart of Bradley's work.
All right.
Like, what were the big questions that he was obsessed with?
Yeah, well,
What were the main areas of philosophy that he focused on?
he really wasn't a one-trick pony.
Okay.
He delved into a bunch of areas like history and ethics, logic, and of course, his most famous area, metaphysics.
Right.
So let's start with his early work on the philosophy of history.
Okay.
This actually ended up influencing another prominent philosopher, R.G. Collingwood.
Oh, wow.
And in this work, Bradley, he really focuses on the limitations of historical knowledge.
Limitations of historical knowledge. That sounds kind of relevant
Well, yeah,
to today,
especially today.
Fake news and all this kind of.
Right, exactly.
It raises all sorts of questions about how we know what we know. How do we determine what's reliable information?
Yeah.
What's the role of interpretation?
Right, right.
And how do we, piece together the past
Right. when, it's inherently challenging to really know for sure.
Oh, so Bradley was already wrestling with those issues back then.
He was.
Wow. So, okay, what about ethics? Where did he stand on questions of, morality and all of that?
Well, his main ethical work, it's called Ethical Studies.
Okay.
And in it, he examines and critiques various moral theories like hedonism, Kantian ethics. He kind of dissects their assumptions, exposes their flaws and contradictions. And he also introduces this concept of the concrete universal.
Concrete universal.
Yeah.
Sounds like something you'd find at Home Depot,
I know.
What's the philosophical meaning behind that?
It's a tricky one. It's basically about how a singular thing, like, a specific person, can also embody a universal concept.
Okay.
So it's kind of about this idea that you can be a unique individual, but also represent something larger, something universal about being human.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Okay. So where did Bradley ultimately land on morality then?
Well, in the end, he argued that, morality, as it's traditionally understood, is actually full of contradictions.
Okay.
And he even suggested that religion might offer a way out of these moral dilemmas.
Oh, interesting.
But that's a conversation for another time.
Yeah, we'll put a pin in that one. Okay, so history, ethics, and he also explored logic,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Was he a big fan of logic?
Well, his major work on logic is called The Principles of Logic.
Okay.
And it's fascinating because it was actually published the same year as Gottlob Frege's groundbreaking work.
Oh, wow.
Which really, pushed formal logic to the forefront.
Yeah.
But unlike Frege, Bradley was more interested in the limitations of formal logic, and how our thinking can go astray.
Oh, interesting. So instead of championing it,
right,
he was looking at like, okay, what are the
potential pitfalls.
the pitfalls? Where can this go wrong?
Exactly. Yeah, he rejected the idea that, judgments are simply just combinations of ideas. Which, if you think about it, it kind of foreshadows some of the more modern critiques of, really simplistic models of the mind.
Right.
Like he was anticipating those arguments, like a century in advance.
That's pretty amazing.
It is.
Yeah. But okay, if even logic has its limits, then where does that leave us?
That's a good question.
In our quest for knowledge and truth.
Right. And that's where his, perhaps most famous and definitely most controversial work comes in, Appearance and Reality.
Okay.
And this is where we enter the realm of metaphysics, the study of
The big questions.
the big questions, the fundamental nature of reality.
Okay.
And this is where things get really interesting.
Right. I'm ready. Appearance and Reality.
Yes.
The title itself sounds like a philosophical thriller.
Doesn't it?
Yeah. So what was he getting at with this whole exploration?
I mean, he was grappling with, some of the biggest questions humanity's ever asked. What is the world really like? What's the relationship between like what we perceive and the true nature of reality? And maybe his most controversial argument in this work is against the reality of relations.
Wait, hold on. Against the reality of relations.
Yeah.
Like saying that things aren't connected to each other.
It sounds crazy.
That sounds like a recipe for chaos.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's really important to understand what he meant by real.
Okay.
He wasn't saying that we don't, experience relationships between things.
Right.
What he was arguing is that those relations aren't fundamental. They're not like, independent building blocks of the universe.
Okay. So he wasn't saying they don't exist.
Right.
But rather that they're not the
ultimate foundation
of reality.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm starting to see where he's going with this, but I can already tell this is going to require some serious mental gymnastics to wrap my head around. Yeah. Okay, so to understand this radical claim, we need to delve into his idea of the absolute.
We do.
All right, let's do it. Unpack the absolute for us. What is it, and how does it fit into Bradley's, whole view of reality?
Well, this is where things get really mind-bending.
Oh, right.
So Bradley believed that ultimately reality is one single unified thing. It's kind of this all-encompassing experience that he called the absolute.
Whoa.
Yeah.
So instead of a world of, separate objects and relations, he's saying it's this underlying, like, unity that connects everything. What does it even mean for reality to be a kind of experience? Are we living in some giant cosmic dream or something?
Well, that is the million-dollar question,
Yeah.
and it gets to the very heart of Bradley's philosophy, so we definitely need to explore that further.
All right. Consider my curiosity piqued. But before we get lost in the mysteries of the absolute, I think we need to take a little break and come back refreshed, and then we can really dive deep into this fascinating,
yes,
if somewhat baffling,
absolutely,
world of Bradley's metaphysics. All right, so we've been talking about F.H. Bradley and how he really liked to challenge, conventional thinking.
Oh, yeah.
especially when it came to the nature of reality.
Absolutely.
And we left off with this idea of this unified experience, the whole thing.
Right.
But before we get too lost in the cosmic soup here,
Yeah.
let's go back to his argument against the reality of relations for a second.
Okay.
You mentioned that that's really crucial to understanding his philosophy. So can you unpack that a bit more for us?
Yeah, sure. So to understand Bradley's argument, you got to kind of start with how we usually think about the world,
Okay.
We see all these distinct objects like a chair, a table, a tree, whatever, and each with its own set of properties. The
Yeah.
chair's brown, hard, made of wood. The table's round, smooth, made of glass. But Bradley, he asks this really simple question. How are all these qualities bound together in a single object?
Yeah.
What makes a thing a thing?
I never really thought about it that way. I just assumed things have properties,
Right.
and that's it.
But when you really stop and think about it,
Yeah.
it raises some pretty interesting questions.
It does, yeah.
And that's what philosophy is all about, right? Challenging those assumptions.
Right.
So one way to explain, the unity of things is to say that there's some underlying substance
Okay.
that holds all the qualities together. It's kind of like, I don't know, like the secret ingredient that makes all the different flavors in a dish blend together,
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So the substance is like the foundation, and then the qualities are kind of built on top of that.
Exactly.
Okay.
But Bradley, he argues that this substance idea, while it seems kind of intuitive, actually leads to more problems.
Okay.
Because if the substance is totally separate from the qualities,
Right.
it becomes this kind of empty, featureless thing, just a placeholder, really, with no defining characteristics.
Right. So it can't just be a blank slate.
Exactly.
It has to have something, some kind of connection to the qualities.
It has to relate to them somehow.
Right.
And that brings us right back to the problem of relations.
Okay.
Because if we can't explain unity through this mysterious substance,
Yeah.
it seems like the only other option is to say that the qualities themselves are related to each other.
Right.
It's those relations that kind of bind everything together.
I'm following you.
Okay, good.
But wait a minute. Wasn't Bradley arguing against the reality of relations?
He was.
Isn't that a contradiction?
Well, that's the brilliant and kind of mind-boggling part of his argument.
Yeah.
He says, look, if relations are just as real and independent as the qualities they relate,
Yeah.
then you end up with a problem. You'd need another relation to connect the relation to the quality, and then another relation to connect that relation, and so on, forever.
Right, like an infinite regress.
Exactly. It's like trying to build a house of cards.
Okay.
You just keep needing more and more cards to support the structure.
And it never feels stable.
It never feels stable. So we're stuck in this dilemma. We have this mysterious substance that doesn't really explain anything.
Right.
Or we have this infinite regress of relations.
Yeah.
And it just goes on forever. So
Yep.
Bradley says neither of these, at least how they're traditional understood, can really explain the unity of things.
Okay.
And he proposes this radical solution
Okay.
that both qualities and relations are grounded in something more fundamental.
All right.
Something he calls the absolute.
So the absolute, again, it's like the glue
In a way, yeah.
that holds everything together.
But it's not like the, just static glue. It's more like a dynamic process of experience.
Okay.
Think of it like this. Everything that exists, relations, qualities, all of it,
Yeah.
exists within this all-encompassing experience. It's this unified flow of reality. They're not, separate things just bumping into each other. They're all aspects of this single interconnected whole.
So instead of thinking the world as like, separate objects, we should think of it as, I don't know, like a tapestry.
Yes.
Woven from the threads of this underlying unity.
It's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this shift in perspective, it really has some pretty profound implications.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it challenges that classic philosophical distinction between subject and object.
The knower and the known.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That distinction has been kind of a cornerstone of Western philosophy for centuries.
Right.
And it's led to, endless debates about how we can ever really know anything about the world outside our own minds.
Yeah. Yeah.
But Bradley's monism, this belief in the underlying unity,
Right.
it really shakes up that whole framework.
So if everything is ultimately part of this absolute experience, this unity,
Mm-hmm.
then there isn't really a hard line
Not really, no.
between the knower and the known.
Right. They're both just, they're aspects of the same underlying reality, like two sides of the same coin.
Oh, I see.
So knowledge isn't about, bridging this unbridgeable gap between mind and world.
Right.
It's more about recognizing our interconnectedness with reality, our participation in the flow of the absolute.
That's a very different way of thinking about knowledge.
It is.
Yeah. It makes me think of that quote by the physicist, John Wheeler. He said, we are not only observers, we are participators. In some strange sense, this is a participatory universe.
That's a great connection.
Yeah.
And this participatory view of knowledge really ties back to Bradley's idea of truth as coherence and comprehensiveness.
Right, right.
Remember, he wasn't a fan of that simple correspondence theory of truth where it's like, oh, this belief is true if it just matches up with reality.
Yeah, he thought that was way too simplistic.
Way too simplistic. He thought
Right.
truth was more about seeing the bigger picture,
Yeah.
how everything fits together.
Right. But how does that idea of coherence connect to this whole monistic worldview?
Well, if reality is this unified whole, then the truest beliefs are the ones that best reflect that unity.
Okay.
The ones that really grab the interconnectedness of things, not just in like, a logical sense, but in a deeper, more comprehensive way.
So like putting a jigsaw puzzle together,
Yeah.
the individual pieces, they don't really make sense until you see how they all fit into the whole picture.
Exactly.
Right.
And for Bradley, the pursuit of truth, it's not just about collecting, isolated facts.
Mm-hmm.
It's about striving for this more comprehensive view of reality, understanding how those pieces fit together,
Yeah.
and recognizing the limitations of our own perspectives.
This is making me rethink how I approach, learning and understanding.
Mhm.
It's not just about accumulating knowledge.
It's about making those connections.
Yeah, that deeper coherence.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wow, this is really,
It's a lot to take in.
it's mind expanding, I'll say that.
Yes.
Yeah, it is. Okay, but before we get, completely lost in the philosophical cosmos here,
Right.
let's bring things back down to earth a bit.
Okay.
We've been talking a lot about metaphysics,
Mm-hmm.
but what are the, practical implications of all this?
Yeah.
Like how do these Bradmean ideas actually matter in everyday life?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Bradley's philosophy might seem really abstract,
Yeah.
but I do think there are some profound lessons we can take from it.
Okay, like what?
Well, one takeaway is the importance of humility, I think.
Okay.
Bradley's skepticism about our ability to fully grasp reality,
Yeah.
I think it reminds us that we should always be open to revising our beliefs,
Right.
recognizing the limitations of our own perspectives.
Yeah.
And, in today's world, we're constantly bombarded with information,
Yeah.
conflicting
And
opinions.
everyone thinks they're right.
Exactly. This kind of intellectual humility.
Right.
It's more important than ever.
It is. It's so easy to get trapped in your own, echo chamber.
Absolutely.
Thinking you have all the answers. And I think his philosophy is a good reminder to stay curious,
Yes.
to keep asking questions,
Yeah.
and to be, willing to change your mind when
Absolutely.
you need to.
Yeah, be open to new information and new perspective.
Yeah.
That's key.
Yeah. And another key takeaway is that interconnectedness of things, right?
Okay.
Like Bradley's emphasis on the unity of reality
Right.
challenges us to, see beyond those artificial divisions and separations, right?
Mhm.
Whether it's, different areas of knowledge or different cultures,
Yeah.
or even between, us and the natural world.
Yeah, it's all connected.
Yeah, and he encourages us to find those underlying connections, those threads that kind of weave together the tapestry of existence,
Yeah. I love that. That's a great image.
It is a powerful message.
It is.
And it really resonates with me
Yeah.
because it makes you realize that we're not just these isolated individuals, but we're part of something much, much grander.
We are.
Yeah. And I'm starting to see why there's this renewed interest in Bradley's work. Even if you don't agree with all of his conclusions, his philosophy offers, a really fresh perspective.
It does.
On some fundamental questions.
It does, yeah. And his focus on experience as the ultimate ground of reality. It's,
Yeah.
it's something that's really resonating with philosophers today, who are exploring new ways of understanding consciousness, embodiment, and our relationship to the world.
Okay.
So it's really interesting stuff.
Well, this has been an incredibly thought-provoking deep dive into the world of F.H. Bradley.
Yeah.
We've explored his life, his ideas, and their relevance to, our modern world. We've tackled his argument against the reality of relations, and we delved into, the mind-bending concept of the absolute.
It's a lot.
It is.
But there's still so much more to uncover.
There is, and in our final segment, we'll continue to explore the depths of Bradley's thought, delving into his views on ethics, religion, and the nature of the self. Welcome back to our day dive into F.H. Bradley.
Yeah,
We've been on quite a journey,
Yeah.
exploring his life, his ideas, and, how they've kind of stood the test of time.
Yeah, yeah.
We've wrestled with his argument against the reality of relations. We delved into the heady realms of the absolute.
It's a big one.
It is. It is.
Big idea.
But there's one more area we got to explore.
Right.
Before we wrap things up. His views on ethics and the self. We touched on it earlier, his critique of traditional moral theories. But I'm curious to hear more about what he proposed in their place.
Well, this is where Bradley's metaphysics really starts to inform his ethical vision.
Okay.
He argued that ultimate reality is this unified, all-encompassing experience.
Right.
The absolute.
Right.
So for Bradley, the ethical life, it's all about, realizing our place within that unity. It's about moving beyond this illusion of separateness and recognizing our interconnectedness with everything.
So instead of focusing on, following rules or calculating happiness,
right,
Bradley's ethics is more about understanding our place in the grand scheme of things.
It is, yeah.
Aligning ourselves with this deeper reality.
Exactly. It's about, recognizing that our individual selves aren't these isolated, self-contained units.
Right.
But they're actually expressions of the absolute itself. And he uses the term, the concrete universal
right.
to describe how a particular thing, like a person, can embody a universal concept.
Right. Okay. So in Bradley's view, ethical development is about, realizing this more profound self,
yes,
this connection to the absolute that kind of transcends our limited egocentric perspective.
Exactly. It's about, moving beyond just self-interest
right,
and recognizing the inherent value and interconnectedness of everything. It's about understanding that, our actions have these ripple effects. To go way beyond our immediate sphere.
That's a powerful idea. It's not just about personal choices then.
No.
It's about our relationship with the larger whole. It sounds almost like, I don't know, like a spiritual journey.
It does have that element to it, a process of, expanding our awareness to encompass this wider reality.
And, speaking of spirituality, where did Bradley stand on religion?
Well, he was definitely critical of organized religion and, dogma.
Okay.
But he did see religion at its best, as a potential path towards this deeper unity with the absolute. For him, religion could point us beyond our limited conceptions of self and world,
right,
and offer a glimpse of this more profound reality.
So it seems like for Bradley, ethics and metaphysics, they're inseparable.
They are.
His understanding of ultimate reality really shapes his whole vision of the good life.
It does, and that's what makes his philosophy so challenging.
Yeah.
But also so rewarding. It's
right,
not just, these abstract theories. It's really an invitation to see the world differently.
Yeah.
To live our lives in a way that reflects this deeper understanding of who we are and where we belong.
Okay. So after this deep dive into Bradley, what would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
That's a good question.
Why should we care about this philosopher who's kind of been neglected?
Well, I think Bradley offers us a powerful antidote to the fragmentation and alienation that we see, in so much of modern life.
Yeah.
His focus on unity, interconnectedness, and the limits of our individual perspectives.
Yeah.
Really encourages us to think more holistically, to recognize those deeper connections that bind us together.
Right.
And I think that's a message that feels especially relevant today.
Yeah.
When we're facing all these global challenges that really require collective action, a sense of shared responsibility.
That really resonates with me, in a world that often feels so divided, so polarized. Bradley reminds us that we're not just these isolated individuals.
We're part of something much bigger.
Yeah, yeah.
And even if, you don't buy into his whole metaphysical system, his philosophy raises these really profound questions.
It does.
About, the nature of reality, the limits of knowledge, the meaning of a good life.
Yeah.
And those questions are just as relevant today as they were in Bradley's time.
Well said. And, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has.
Herbert Bradley might have been a reclusive scholar.
Yeah.
But his ideas, they really have the power to challenge our assumptions.
They do.
Inspire us to see the world with fresh eyes.
Yeah.
He reminds us to question, to explore, and to seek this more unified, harmonious understanding
of
ourselves and the universe we inhabit.
I think, maybe that's Bradley's most enduring legacy. This invitation to embark on this lifelong journey of philosophical inquiry.
Right.
It's a continuous process of, questioning, exploring, expanding our horizons.
Yeah.
It's a journey that takes us, beyond the limits of our own minds into the heart of the mystery that we call reality.
That's beautiful. I love that. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the mind of F.H. Bradley. We encourage you to explore his work and see what insights you might uncover for yourselves. And until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the world of ideas.